The Online News Act is one I'd like to start with you about because it's about journalism. It's having a direct impact, and we're being told that it's for our best. It's going to make everything better for us. What were your thoughts before it became law, and how do you feel the kind of outcomes are impacting Canadians?
Yeah, I had concerns from the very beginning about this legislation, and those concerns have really been borne out. I covered this issue, as you know, a lot this summer on the podcast. I did a series this summer on the collapse of the Canadian media. I don't think it is hyperbolic to use that word. Unfortunately, we're in a very extreme crisis in the Canadian media right now. And looking at this legislation, I had a number of different guests on. And there are a number of ways to sort of look at this legislation. One of the views that I think is important to think about is the role that lobbying from big media played in the sort of journey towards this legislation. So Mark Edge, a BC media historian, recently published a book about this, The Post-Media Effect. And he really goes into great detail about the evolution of the thinking on how to approach the crisis in the media and the specific role that the big media played in lobbying for a certain outcome. So, of course, in the beginning, the Liberal government's official stance was that they would not be propping up failed business models. But that has changed very dramatically, that stance. And there's been, a lot of work looking at that lobbying. Blacklock's reporter revealed the role that Isabel Metcalfe, a lobbyist who was previously a Liberal candidate, actually played. And she had, I believe it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 meetings with senior officials on this topic. This is before the media bailouts, which was somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 million for the Canadian media. And so lobbying is a concern here. I think it's something we need to think about and think critically about. Also, there's a faulty premise at the heart of this legislation, and that premise is that big tech is stealing news content from us news providers. I don't believe that is the case. I think the value actually flows in the other direction, that big tech like Facebook, like Google, searching, our content and linking to our content actually benefits us and benefits us greatly. So I think that's a faulty premise, and one that actually some people would argue sort of endangers the proper functioning of the internet. So that's something else to think about here. And then you have the fact that the money from C-18, should it flow into government coffers, which there is some debate about whether this will happen, because Meta and Facebook have said they're out. They're not going to link to news content at all and have stopped linking. And Google is reserving judgment, but there's a possibility that Google will also not index our work in search engines, which would be a huge detriment to journalism in this country and to news consumers in this country. So, but if that money does flow into coffers, it does look like it will go to the incumbents, that it will flow to the big telecommunications companies like Bell, which are already quite profitable enterprises, even if their news divisions may not be, to Post Media, which is effectively owned by a U.S. hedge fund. Some financial wizardry has allowed them to get past the foreign ownership requirement, but it is effectively owned by hedge funds in the U.S. and is carrying significant debt and spending a lot of money servicing that debt. So do we want money to go to prop up an enterprise that is, servicing debt for a U.S. hedge fund? That's, I think, an important question to ask. And then there's also the issue of the CBC, which would be a large beneficiary, if not the largest beneficiary from this legislation. CBC is, of course, already funded by the Canadian taxpayer. I believe it should continue to be funded. I think it's questionable if it should be funded twice. So, and I know this is a very long answer, so I'll stop talking in a minute. But the next question, I think, is whether or not this legislation will stifle innovation. And certainly from the independents that I've heard from, that is the consensus view among independents, because independents really rely on social media and on the big tech platforms to create an audience. So that's not an insignificant concern. And then just lastly, I think we have to think about trust. And trust in the media is incredibly low in this country right now. And there are some good reasons for that. But is introducing a business model in which the majority of the funding that flows into the media is coming from either government or from big tech, is that going to increase public trust in the media, in us as an independent, free press corps? I think there's a very strong argument to make that that is not going to be the case. So those are my 5 areas of concern.